Now on BBC Two this Tuesday, Politics Live with Joe Coburn.
Today, can the COVID inquiry give us answers? Will Boris Johnson be back? And should women ever be jailed for having an abortion? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Craig McKinley, Labour MP and Shadow Policing Minister Sarah Jones, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home Henry Hill, and columnist and broadcaster Ayesha Hazarika. Today, bereaved families gather outside the COVID inquiry as public hearings begin.
They tested him and they said it's definitely COVID.
We were told he was going to die imminently, and the only thing we could do was be outside his window in the icy, sleety rain.
The inquiry is due to last 3 years. Today, the Chair makes this pledge.
I have promised many times that those who suffered hardship and loss are and will always be at the heart of the inquiry. Their loss will be recognised.
Is civil war back in the Conservative Party? Is the Prime Minister talking rubbish? Is Boris right?
As Boris Johnson tells his supporters he'll be back, how damaging will his row with Rishi Sunak be for the Conservatives? And as a woman is jailed for taking pills to end her late-term pregnancy, is it time for the law to be changed? You saw in the headlines there, the COVID inquiry has now started in earnest. We've had some preliminary hearings for some time, but the main hearing started this morning. And the chair, Baroness Hallett, made some opening remarks. Let's listen to a little bit more of her.
As people arrived at the hearing centre today, they found a dignified vigil of bereaved family members holding photographs of their loved ones. Their grief was obvious to all. It is on their behalf and on behalf of the millions who suffered and continue to suffer in different ways as a result of the pandemic that I intend to answer the following 3 questions. Was the UK properly prepared for a pandemic? Was the response to it appropriate? And can we learn lessons for the future?
Let's start with this question. Baroness Hallett saying that she wants to learn lessons for the future. Craig, do you think we'll be better prepared for the next pandemic?
I think we would be if it could report rather more quickly. I understand Sweden has done its report on the COVID period. I'm not entirely sure 3 years is as necessary as we might consider. You never know, we might be in something similar within a 3-year cycle, and we'd be saying, well, wouldn't it be useful if we'd had a rather more snappy report that we can actually learn something from? Because that's what this is all about. Not only for the victims and say, what went wrong for me? Were all the measures appropriate? Were the Ferguson reports about real hell and damnation rather overinflated? Have we got a model that works? And can we learn for the future? I'm afraid 3 years, in my view, is a little too long. I want some answers rather more quickly.
Do you think it is too long? Difficult to know, of course, what would be taken out of the inquiry. But do you think the UK will be better prepared next time?
Well, it has to be. That has to be the answer. I mean, it's taken 2 years since the then Prime Minister announced this inquiry, so it's taken a very long time to get started, but it is absolutely important that we get the answers. So the first phase is looking at how prepared we were before the pandemic hit. So we know that the NHS was already in significant trouble with 100,000 vacancies in the NHS, 112,000 vacancies in social care, NHS waiting lists at record highs, A&E targets not met for years. We know already that the NHS was in trouble at that point. But the inequalities that we've seen under this Conservative government also played a part in Croydon. The areas that were the most poor were the ones that were hit the hardest and the quickest, actually, in terms of people in overcrowded housing, people in insecure jobs. So there are lots of answers about how prepared we were. Well, before I come to the other two, do you accept that, that we were so poorly prepared, in Sarah's view, in the lead-up to this pandemic, particularly with things like the NHS running at full capacity?
Well, I give great credit to what the NHS did achieve during that period. When you compare how we did cope, compared to places like Italy that were really overflowing literally into school halls, I think we were in a very different place. But yeah, the NHS is always under stress. You can't have a publicly funded body that has loads of spare capacity within it, because then we'd wonder whether we're rather spending too much. So it's always going to be running hot.
A lot more capacity in 2010 before you came.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. But I think, I pay credit to the NHS for what they did achieve under some very, very tough conditions.
Are you confident we'll be better prepared next time, Henry?
I mean, it depends when next time is. You know, if it's 10 years down the line, that's probably enough time for this inquiry to get done. Really, we need 2 inquiries because, frankly, you could separate the functions. If you want a fact-finding inquiry that's about learning lessons as quickly as possible, you could have an inquisitorial one that takes evidence behind closed doors on a black box, zero-blame basis, and that could report in a year. And then you have this full judicial process, which is much longer, which is about, you know, partly about assigning blame, providing catharsis for victims and everything else. That could take a lot longer. Trying to do all of those things in one process is deeply suboptimal.
What do you think?
I've got some sympathy with what Craig says about the time scale, because I do think that's something that, you know, people will want us to be prepared as quickly as possible. Rather concerningly, there are reports even in today's newspapers that the NHS is actually less prepared now than it was pre-pandemic if something was to hit, because of the backlog caused by the pandemic. So I think we've got to learn lessons about the whole process. And I think we've got to try and separate 2 things. Of course, there is going to be a who said what to when and these ministerial decisions. And there'll be the sort of tittle-tattle of, you know, who said what in different WhatsApp messages and things. And that is something that there will be interest in. You can't deny that. But we've got to sort of set our sights on the higher things, which is learning the lessons. And part of that, I also think, needs to look at the PPE stuff as well. I think that is a really important thing to look at, you know, how that was all commissioned and how some of those contracts were given out.
That's very difficult, isn't it? If you think we need to be more prepared, you would need to have warehouses full of PPE ready to go. The trouble is the PPE has got a sell-by date on it.
No, it's not,
you know, how do you get it absolutely right?
We have to always have
difficult.
PPE ready. It's looking, if we ever have a situation like this, how do you ensure you get a system which is swift but doesn't bypass kind of sensible procurement rules and mates and cronies who've got no clue about making this stuff.
Well, that's a balance.
There's a whole section on procurement that Baroness Hallett is going to be...
And no doubt the fast track that the government, Labour. One question to look at, and that is the impact of lockdowns and restrictions, because there is certainly now more and more discussion about whether that had a more negative effect than thought at the time. But these are difficult decisions to make when you're in the room facing a pandemic. Have you changed your view on that?
No, I voted against just about all of the measures, I believe. I was probably one of the most rebellious. I was very concerned about the banding, and you had the ridiculous things where a village straddled 2 bands and one side the pub could open, the other side couldn't. I voted against all this nonsense, and I'll tell you why it got completely nonsensical. That a couple could actually be living together, be a member of the same golf club, but they weren't allowed to play golf together on their own golf club, but they could walk across it. When things became that mad, I'm afraid I did switch off to some of these measures.
Well, Keir Starmer, in the main, supported the lockdowns. In fact, he would have liked at some point... Well, in fact, as I was going to say, at some point wanted to go further and certainly stay in lockdown for longer. Do you think that was the right approach?
So obviously we need to look at what happened, but the purpose of lockdown was to stop the NHS getting so overwhelmed that they couldn't look after all the other people that were sick. Now, we know that making sure people were protected saved lives, and we know that where people weren't protected, in the care homes, for example, where there was no PPE and people were just sent back without any protection, people died unnecessarily. Those are the lessons we have to learn. Calling those measures nonsense, I think, is deeply wrong and
so you think stopping a couple they could walk across their golf course but they couldn't play on it was a sensible measure?
By looking at some small niche example that you've...
No, I'll give you loads of them.
Well, no,
I gave the Wilkinson's conundrum. I gave the Wilkinson's conundrum at the time.
Staying at home and making those sacrifices that everybody made saved lives.
I called it the Wilkinson's conundrum. Wilkinson's could open, selling everything that it sold, including pots and pans. The independent pots and pan seller next door had to close. That's how daft this became, and Labour wanted more of it and deeper.
Well, let me show you the front page of the Mirror, because it is looking at this COVID inquiry with its headline, "New Insult to COVID Victims," it says, as our Prime Minister and ex-Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, bicker like toddlers. This is, yes, the row that we covered yesterday, the war of words. Rishi Sunak coming out fighting over accusations of interfering in his predecessor, Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. And Boris Johnson has retorted that everything Number 10 has said, which was that they didn't do something that Boris Johnson asked them to do. They didn't think it was their place. It was all rubbish. Where does this leave the Conservative Party, Henry?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's not an ideal position for the Conservative Party to be in. Rishi Sunak has been trying. The first stage of his leadership was, I'm not Liz Truss, look, I've steadied the ship. And the second stage was, look, this government is actually focusing on the issues that matter to voters. And so he has his 5 pledges. He wanted to talk about his trip to the United States, trying to show global leadership on AI. And instead, he has once again been sucked into a media cycle that's all about internal Conservative Party psychodrama. And frankly, it's his own fault. We've known this report was coming for ages. He could have held off on approving Boris Johnson's resignation honours list until we got the report. Instead, he signed off 2 days in advance, and this is mostly his doing.
What do you think, Aisha? I mean, he came out fighting Rishi Sunak. Do you think it's improved his standing, actually coming out and saying, well, if they don't like it, Boris Johnson and their supporters, in terms of what I say I did in that resignation honours list, tough?
I mean, it was something, kind of reminds of like Scrappy Doo sort of yapping back at Big Dog. I mean, it didn't really feel like this was a sort of, this is probably the only like evidence of any backbone we've seen from Rishi Sunak. So yes, I mean, I think it's better that he did it than not. But I think Rishi Sunak has really got to send a really strong signal to people like Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries, all these people who are just, out of control now. Because look, I've come from a different sort of political tradition, but there are many good members of the Conservative Party who are absolutely distraught at what is going on. This is actually, as a commentator, it's easy to look at this stuff and laugh and be like, oh, this is actually quite funny. And some of it is, quite frankly, hilarious. Actually, it's deeply terrible for our country. We have a country which is going through so many problems, and we have a government which is falling apart, fighting. It was like a circular firing squad at the moment. And to be honest, I think Rishi Sunak has got to this is his moment actually to show a bit of toughness and to say to these people, enough is enough. It doesn't matter, he's done a little bit of snapping back. It's not enough.
Do you agree, Craig?
Well, I think for most people who are watching this, reading this, they see this as very much Westminster bubble that's not particularly relevant to them. It was always going to happen with Boris doing that big resignation. He's always one to surprise us, always one to keep on the front pages, and it's worked, and we're talking about it today. But I think this will come and go. I don't know what the truth is about the House of Lords Appointment Committee and the lists, and quite frankly, do you know what? I don't really care anymore. I want us to get on with governing.
Right. And what about Boris Johnson? Do you think he'll be back? We can show you in the Express. He's given an interview. And they certainly think he will be back. Would you like to see him come back?
He has got those qualities that we rarely see in politicians. They're not boring and grey like I am. He's got that ability to attract people to the Conservative brand. He did that in spades times 10. And we got an 80 majority. So he has qualities that I think the Conservative Party will miss.
What about the qualities like he's a pathological liar, he's a deep narcissist, he cares about one person himself, he's deeply disloyal to everybody, everything around him, and he's prepared. You mentioned the lockdown rules and how ridiculous they were. He's the one that stood every single night in front of the TV cameras, lecturing us, locking us into our own homes, and then disobeying the rules themselves. How can you say with a straight face that you think he's got great leadership qualities?
Let's see what he achieved.
What did he achieve?
In terms of an electoral breakthrough for the Conservative Party.
And then what did he do with it? What did he do with it?
He didn't play the good pack of cards that he was given, I'll grant you that.
He spaffed it up the wall, to quote a phrase from him.
Is that not important? His resignation letter was a repudiation of his own record. He said, why are we raising taxes? He broke a manifesto commitment to raise national insurance. He said, why have we done nothing about retained EU law? He was Prime Minister for 3 years, didn't even table the retained EU law bill. We had to wait for Liz Truss to do that. Nothing he said about being a proper Conservative government in his letter, he actually did. You're an accountant. Yeah, there's a credit column for Boris Johnson, but there's also a debit column, and isn't it bigger, surely, by now?
Well, I mean, I put myself down as a supporter of Boris Johnson, but I wasn't a particular cheerleader. I recognised his qualities electorally, but also knew a lot of his faults politically. It could have been a real golden era for Conservative politics, and it's a shame.
The Conservatives could have been in for 3 terms. I mean, I remember that the night he won, I thought, wow, he's going to be leader for possibly. I mean, it's going to be.
It takes a while to get rid of the 80 majority, doesn't it?
Yeah. And what it does that to have done that so quickly? Do you concede that that is terrible?
I think it's a great shame. Yes, I do. I think I wouldn't use some of the lively language you have. I mean, I don't tend to accuse people of being liars.
He is lying. Well, hang on. Let me just go back. Let me just go back though to the interview that he's given. Boris, believe me, I shall return to frontline politics. He actually says, "I'll be back." He says nothing less than absolute victory against Labour and total Brexit will do. What did you make of that?
Those words don't mean anything, right? What is total?
Well, they excite Craig McKinley.
He didn't table the retained EU law bill. He has no interest in the detail. Basically, Boris is happier the further he is from actually having to put any of his rhetoric into action.
He had great hands in his, a pack of cards in his hands.
And he failed to play them, right? It was his fault. Boris is great at being a columnist. He's great at spinning illusions for people. But when he's actually in power, he doesn't do anything with it. And that's why it would be mad to have him back in the Parliamentary Conservative Party destabilising a future government.
Well, you've mentioned policies and policies that he didn't actually follow through on. This is something Rishi Sunak, Craig, says he does want to deliver on. One of those is small boats. A week or so ago, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, said his policies to tackle it are starting to work. And yet figures yesterday say the precise opposite. What do you make of Rishi Sunak's delivery?
Well, last week, yes, there were some better figures. We've tackled what I'd call some of the low-hanging fruit, the Albanian issue, which I think people could never quite understand how an EU applicant country, a NATO country, signed up to the ECHR itself, how we could have even accepted any asylum claims from that country, where most of Europe doesn't.
Sure,
so
but
we've attacked some of that, and we've solved some of that, but we've got to go so much further. 616 landed on Kent beaches on Sunday, and let's get this into some pounds and pence. That is likely to cost £30 million to house and look after those people for a year.
Right.
Well, £30 million landed on Sunday. We've got to do something about this. We gave the French an almost unlimited amount of money to stop this problem. And I find it fundamentally difficult to believe that France managed to project a significant military power into Mali, a West African country, but can't patrol plus or minus 3 miles from Calais.
What's the impact on Tory voters? Will they continue to vote Conservative?
Well, I don't think they're going to vote Labour because Labour want open borders. But, I mean, we're not doing a very good job of it.
In Dover and Thanet, Labour just took control of the council, so they did literally vote Labour in the areas most affected.
Well, I've not had one elector say that Labour's going to solve this immigration problem.
But what damage is it going to do to the Conservative Party's fortunes? Not just this issue, but what is happening now?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, on immigration, the Conservatives keep talking about this and they're not delivering, which is worse than not talking about it. It is a real concern for voters. If the Conservatives were actually tackling it, that would be great. But endlessly talking about how terrible it is and then having another year of high numbers come up is absurd, and it undermines faith in politics. Whereas what this story, which is, dominating the media cycle, the report's coming tomorrow, it will dominate another week, it just seems to suggest that the Conservative government is not able or willing to focus on the issues that matter most to voters. Rishi Sunak has a year and a bit, maybe, before the next election. He's got to try and convince millions of people who voted Tory for the first time in 2019 that they didn't make a mistake. And instead, we're having an argument with Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson resigned because he got sight of the committee report, the Privileges Committee of MPs who have been looking into whether he misled Parliament. Clearly, they've concluded that he has. And so he quit. That is going to lead to a by-election in his constituency and 2 others. A huge opportunity for Labour and a huge mountain to climb. You need a massive swing to win those seats. Not his, actually, but the other 2.
No, we do. And just to the point of Boris Johnson, I want to agree with Craig. We don't really want to be talking about this stuff. We were all fed up of talking about Boris Johnson. We've had years.
Yeah, but what are you going to do to ensure that you actually make cut through in those by-elections?
It matters because they are an all-out war when they should be running the country. So when we have
it'll be real failure if you don't win those by-elections.
We will be saying, well, inflation all-time high, waiting lists all-time high, tax all-time high.
And if you don't win them, what message will that say about Keir Starmer?
We will go out to win all of those, and we will do what we can to make the argument. But at the moment, the Conservatives are making the argument for us because the country is in such a state. And when it comes to the small boats, just on that point, because it's really important, Rishi Sunak having a press conference, making a speech when the numbers start to go down and then the sun comes out, and obviously there are more small boats. The point is, once people get to the French coast, you've lost the race. You need to be, this is what Labour keeps saying, we need a squad of police in Europe to get to the people who are running the criminal gangs, because by the time they get to the French coast, when we're giving the French government all the money to try and stop people, it's too late. We need to go
so
up
what you're
to the
saying is your grand policy is you'll have a better partnership with France than we do.
I want to talk about the political implications.
Our policy is a 5-point plan, which is very comprehensive and covers a lot of areas and will actually have an impact.
Is it convincing people, Aisha? This is a moment of opportunity for Labour with these by-elections coming up. There are two of them with healthy Conservative majorities. Craig McKinley reckons there's not enough cut-through yet for Labour's policy on things like immigration. How difficult is this going to be for Labour to make an impact and win those by-elections? And if he doesn't, what will people conclude?
Well, I think we've got to take a step back. At the last set of local elections, Labour made a huge amount of progress, as did the Liberal Democrats, to be fair, but you cannot in any way look at the set of results and say that that was a terrible night for Labour. It was a very good night for Labour. You look at the polls consistently, there is a Labour lead now.
They need a 10% swing, don't they, though, to win it?
Anything is in the bag. Remember, Keir Starmer has to get the same swing that Tony Blair did in 1997. That just gives a working majority of 1
or 2.
So I think with these by-elections on the horizon, I think Uxbridge should be, relatively
Boris Johnson, Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
For the Conservatives. I think Nigel Adams' seat in Selby may be more difficult. The interesting thing about Mid-Bedfordshire, if Nadine Dorries goes, by the way, she hasn't yet resigned, so there could be a whole new psychodrama going on with that, ... Park that to one side. The interesting thing for the Labour and the Liberal Democrats, if they both fight hard there, the Tories could come up the middle. So one does ask the question, would it be sensible for the Labour and the Liberal Democrats to do a kind of an informal alliance? Because I think if that happened, you might go, but that might help you win that seat, keep that seat, if they don't do that. The other thing importantly,
I don't think the electorate likes shabby deals.
Scotland,
they really
there's possibly going to be a by-election in Rutherglen, which will be good for Labour. If they win that doubles the number of Scottish MPs for one. But that is a good sign of progress, to be fair. Yes.
An informal deal with the Liberal Democrats?
We're not in the business of doing pacts with other parties. We want everybody to be able to vote Labour. So that will be the situation. There'll be a Labour candidate in all of those seats. And we will do our best to put forward our positive message of how we can turn this country round, stop that decline that we've seen over the last 13 years and make this country on the upward direction again after 13 years of managed decline.
Yeah, but you talk about pacts. There were pacts going on during these local elections. They were clearly seen in some seats where, yes, of course, Labour and Lib Dems and Greens did stand, but there was a backroom deal to say, well, we're not going to do very much. And it's yours for the taking.
There's also tactical voting that goes on, Craig, which you have to recognise. There are going to be some people with the anti-Tory sentiment is so high, they will vote for whoever will knock out the Tory, and that's not backroom news. That's just like where the public is on a lot of things.
But I don't speak for Barbara from Bristol. There's Brenda from Bristol,
who said not another one.
By-elections caused under these circumstances are never popular with local electors. The turnouts are never very high. And if a Conservative has resigned and the electors can't see an obvious reason why, because there's no obvious reason why Nadine or Nigel have gone.
Well, she didn't get a peerage.
Well, yeah, but no obvious sort of political...
She said so.
No, but since you've mentioned...
But electors don't like it.
Right, well, since you've mentioned Nadine Dorries and you say the reason is because she didn't get a peerage, she was one of those MPs kept off the list or removed from the list, as Boris Johnson's supporters have said. This was her reaction on Talk TV with Piers Morgan to what happened.
This story is about a girl from Breck Road in Liverpool who worked every day of her life since she was 14 years old, had something offered to her for that people from that background don't get offered, removed by two privileged posh boys who went to Winchester and Oxford and taken away duplicity and cruelly because they have known for months that it wasn't the case, and yet they let me and they let Boris Johnson continue to believe that was the case.
Does she have a point, Craig?
She never holds back, Nadine,
well, that's
as we
not
know.
Quite what I asked.
She never does. But I would have thought a way could be found to say, yeah, gentleman's agreement being talked about in the background that when there is dissolution, Nadine will get her peerage. But I mean, it's lists an argument, and quite frankly, we're still talking about it, aren't we?
Does she have a point?
No, not really. I think she's doing herself a disservice because she's not just some girl from wherever she's from. She's quoted to Nadine Dorries, who is a political actor with very pronounced opinions and a strong profile. And fundamentally, the reason that if whatever happened inside that black box of the process, it's not because of discrimination against her background, it's because of who she is as a politician. And I think it's really quite tedious, especially for a Conservative MP, to be playing this kind of identitarian card in this way. No, Nadine Dorries rose or fell on her political merits.
Let's talk about something completely different. I want to show you this headline from the BBC. Mother jailed for taking abortion pills after legal limit. Yes, Carla Foster was between 32 and 34 weeks pregnant when she took medication acquired via the Pills by Post scheme introduced during lockdown. Abortion is legal up to 24 weeks and the procedure must be carried out in a clinic after 10 weeks. But the question is, was it in the public interest to send a woman to jail for having an abortion, Craig?
I think aborting a very late-term fetus at that stage is deeply troubling. I'm not anti-abortion, not at all. But I think this is another hangover from the COVID period that we went up this sort of pills by post. And I read as much as I could about the transcription. This is deeply troubling. But she did tell a clear lie to the BPAS to solicit these drugs, which are powerful drugs. And I say, this is another COVID hangover. It's a deeply troubling story. I know she's got, I think, 14 months in prison and then rest on licence, so she's probably likely to be out in 7 months or less. But if we don't have this, we either have the law to protect unborn children or we don't. I know there's many activists in the Labour Party who would like to see very late-term abortions. That's not the space I'm in. We've had a settled argument about abortion for a long time. 10 weeks by tablet, up to 24 weeks with medical supervision. It's been settled. I think that's where we are. We're comfortable with it. And I don't think this case alone opens that argument.
Sarah?
Well, I wouldn't use abortion to take a swipe at the Labour Party. This has always been
Well, you do have activists who want...
it's always
they're
been
also within the
and there are
Conservative
views
Party
across all the parties. This is a very different issue. So I'd say on this, it doesn't feel right. What's happened. Of course, they were very unique circumstances with COVID, and these things happen very rarely. A similar case,
so was it in the public interest to send her to prison?
About, if you just let me kind of explain, 10 years ago was the last time we had a similar kind of case. So this is very rare. But it doesn't, to me, feel right. Now, I think what's interesting is we need to look at the two different laws that now exist in Northern Ireland and in the rest of the United Kingdom. So in Northern Ireland, the law now puts the onus on the doctor to not undertake an abortion after a certain time, not on the person, whereas in the UK it's different. So I think we probably need to look at this and we need to make sure we have a system that doesn't, that makes sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. We need to get it right. This is complicated.
I understand that, but should she have been prosecuted?
Should
she have been prosecuted? The point is, there was a point at which public interest could have been taken into account. In whose public interest, rightly or wrongly, was it that she went to jail?
Well, on the specific case, I mean, we can't talk too much about it because it will go to appeal, I'm sure. But there aren't sentencing guidelines on this, so the government could ask the Sentencing Council to come up with some guidance here, because there wasn't any, as I understand it, and that was one of the issues that the judge faced.
At an earlier stage, there could have been a decision not to prosecute. It's true, once the decision had been made to go to court, then the judge said very clearly that this is an emotive subject, but it's a matter for Parliament, because he was just imposing the law as he saw it. Do you think it was right to do so?
Yes,
right, you
absolutely.
Do. Why?
We're very lucky in this country that we haven't had abortion become the sort of culture war issue it is in the United States. And the reason for that is that we settled our abortion law democratically with the 67 Act. Part of the 67 Act was establishing the upper limit. And so abortions over the upper limit are criminal offences. And it is important that if we are to maintain that limit, especially in the face of professional bodies who are advocating for effectively abortion up to birth, that we enforce those laws when those laws are broken. Now, the idea of shifting the onus to the doctor, as in Northern Ireland, is an interesting one. But for that to work, you have to have the doctor as an active agent in the process, which would involve going back to the system pre-COVID, where you did not have abortifacients available on demand for people after 10 weeks. It should be the case, as it used to be, that you have abortion up to 10 weeks via the pill, and then afterwards you need to involve a doctor, and once we've done that, we can then talk about moving the onus of responsibility.
I mean, I just think this case is so heartbreaking. It kind of reminds you of sort of what it was like to live in Victorian Britain when this kind of stuff, when women didn't have any control over that. I mean, when you look at how our criminal justice system works, isn't it amazing that so many people, basically male rapists, are allowed to get away with, you know, their cases fall by the wayside, and yet you have this case and this woman is ending up going to prison for a longer period of time than many other people who commit other really, really terrible offences. We have to change the law on this. It is ridiculous.
But do you think this is a terrible crime that she committed?
This is ridiculous that we have a situation where we are governed by a law from the 1870s. I think we've got to be moving to a situation where we decriminalise abortion. Well, I think that's exactly the direction of travel. It should not be a criminal. This is a health issue. This woman needed help. She should not be going to prison.
Well, I mean, so if you decriminalise abortion up to birth, that means that you would end up with 8-month-old fetuses, perfectly viable prenatal children who could currently be, who could be born and live, and they could be killed, right? The reason that we have an abortion limit is because at the start of a pregnancy, a fetus is a fetus and it's a bundle of cells. At the end of a pregnancy, a fetus is a baby. And so we have to draw the line somewhere. We can never draw it perfectly. But if you decriminalise abortion up to birth, you are allowing the murder or killing of prenatal children.
But this situation, we have got to shift the law on this. The idea that we are still kind of wedded to this idea that you introduce criminality into what is a woman's health issue. This woman was...
There's another person involved. It's a clash of rights.
Well, I would always say, by the way, that, I mean, look, when you get to very, very, very late term, it gets more difficult. But she needed help. And because of the COVID lockdown situation, she could not get that help. The idea that this woman goes to prison is absolutely... It's awful.
You talk about Victorian era. You know, we have contraception that's widely available and very effective. If you have something of an accident, you can get a morning after pill, very widely available. You can have a pill for abortions up to 10 weeks. You can have access to medical staff for 24 weeks. And
and yet we have a woman going. You have a woman who is going to prison
and you really can't
help.
look after this child. You can give it up for abortion.
Give it up for adoption.
Adoption. I'm so sorry. No, for adoption, there is no way you can have a basically full-term baby and it be no criminal sanction. That, in my view, would be.
Well, Aisha is very clear that she
going to prison.
Do you think she should have gone to prison?
I think it feels wrong, and it really does, and we need to look at this, and I hope the government will listen to people like Caroline Noakes, who are saying this morning, we need to look at this. It's not right. There is a disconnect between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. That's an opportunity to look at this, and also sentencing guidelines, because this
what would you look at? Would you decriminalise it in the way that Aisha is suggesting? And also your colleague Diana Johnson, Labour MP, chair of the Home Affairs, chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who's also said that we need to look at the legislation again. If you decriminalised it, so no one would go to jail, but you kept the regulations in place, that you would still need doctors' advice or sign-off, and there would be restrictions, would you sign a Labour government up to doing that?
Well, I mean, we need to look at this. I wouldn't sign a Labour government up to anything on Politics Live right now. But I think it is something we need to look at. There are inconsistencies in the law. It doesn't feel right. This is the overarching issue needs to be that these are women's bodies. This is a healthcare concern for them, but we need to make sure we have the right processes in place. So whether that is the onus is on the healthcare professional, the doctor.
When do prenatal children get rights?
But I just want to ask something. When Diana Johnson brought this measure about decriminalisation, a lot of the arguments were used about this old arcane piece of legislation, saying, look, it's never going to be used. Like, it's never going to be used. Now this woman has gone to prison. And by the way, there are other cases in the pipeline now.
Well, yeah.
And I do think we've got to stop. And Joe's point is right. You would have regulation, so it's not just like it's a free-for-all with this. But at the end of the day, we've got to take a step back and ask ourselves the common sense question. Do we think it's right as a society that people who commit horrendous crimes are not going to prison? And a few women who have been let down during COVID on health grounds are now going in the clink. I think we've got to step back. This sounds mad to me.
Caroline Noakes, the Conservative MP, like Aisha and Sarah, thinks it needs to be looked at. There needs to be a fresh debate, at least, on this issue. You think it's settled. Do you not think this throws up the idea of at least looking at it again?
Well, look, you can always refine the law. As I just said, I think we should reverse the COVID-era regulation of allowing abortifacients to be sent out at home under any circumstances. You can always refine the law. But if Caroline Noakes really wanted to reopen the abortion argument, most public opinion polling favours lowering the overall limit. Does she want that? No, of course she doesn't. So we all benefit from having a broadly settled system. And I'm afraid that part of having a broadly settled system is that when the law is broken, that crime is punished. And fundamentally, there has to be the case, unless you want abortion up to birth, that at some point prenatal children have protection under the law, and killing them is a crime.
Let's leave it there and talk about a different crime, spiking. Spiking someone through drink, drugs or needle injection. There isn't a specific offence to deal with it. Of course, people can be prosecuted under other offences like grievous bodily harm, for example. We can show you a tweet here from Richard Graham, the Conservative MP. Today, he says, is my second attempt to see a change in the law on spiking. My first was 18 months ago. He hopes this time, with strong cross-party support, allows new ministers to find the best way to help change behaviour, send a clear message and make nights out safer for all. Let's talk to Dawn Dines. She's CEO and founder of the charity Stamp Out Spiking. Dawn, welcome to you. What is the scale of this problem?
It is a hugely underreported crime, and we've been campaigning for nearly 2 decades now against drink spiking and other spiking-related issues. And going back quite a few years ago, we contacted every police force throughout the UK to request their freedom of information data. And it's virtually, well, it is impossible to collect the so important and needed data on this hugely underreported crime.
Do you think, or what difference do you think it would make if there was a specific offence when you can already prosecute people under existing laws?
What that would do, first of all, it would give us this all-important data. We've had Operation Leicester, which is now finished. So that means that we've got no data collection currently happening on any spiking crimes whatsoever, because it's done under another law, prosecuted under another law. If we were to get a specific offence code so that spiking's recognised within law, then that would mean that we could adequately train the key emergency services. They would be resourced and trained. We could make spiking compulsory for people who work in the SIA, for example, or bar management, day and nighttime economy. It's because all of these people don't have the correct education why people are getting away with this disgusting crime time and time again.
Aisha, I think you know somebody who was a victim of spiking.
Who had her drink spiked, and actually she thinks she saw the person doing it. Like, she could actually see somebody doing it, and they got fresh drinks, but I think she'd already had a couple of sips of her drink, and she said it was absolutely horrific. Thankfully, somebody got her into a taxi, but God knows what could have happened to her in the taxi. It's so... And some people are doing it just to have a bit of a laugh, and it just leaves people in the worst state. So I do think this is good that this has been looked at again, and it does need to be toughened up.
A new law?
Yeah, I think that the data point is really important, because ultimately sometimes I'm sceptical of politicians introducing new laws because if it's just to make a statement. But the point about data, having the information available to know the extent of this crime and then to provide and justify resourcing proper training would be incredibly useful. So for that, if that's what this bill is doing, then I'm all for it.
Would you be in favour of a new law?
Absolutely. We've called for a new law. I've called for it in debates where the government have just said no, there's no need. For the same point, data, and people are very nervous of coming forward. There's a real kind of victim fear of coming forward because they feel that they're partially to blame. There's all kinds of things going on with victims that I think they would be encouraged to come forward if they knew it was a separate offence, if the police were trained on it, if licensing establishments also had that training. The law is behind what the criminals are doing now.
Do the police take it seriously enough?
They do, and I've been around nightclubs. I've talked to police about this as part of my role. They do take it seriously, and they struggle with it because not enough people come forward, and they don't quite know what to charge people with because there isn't a specific offence. So I do think it would help. The government, I think, are behind on this and need to catch up with where a lot of the rest of us are.
I mean, enforcement is always the issue, but would you be in favour of it?
I'd sort of echo what Henry said about we just need a data field that says this is a GBH offence and it happened to be spiking in this case, so we know the extent of the problem. But it's the bars and restaurants and the SIA, they're at the forefront of this to actually spot this is happening. I mean, we've got CCTV in lots of places these days, so a lot of these events can be spotted. But no, the point of a 10-minute rule, Bill, as we all know, is to raise it up the flagpole, get it higher up the agenda, and if this does that, then all to the good.
What do you make of what you've heard, Dawn? You seem to have, certainly support from the Labour Party and Sarah here, but what about from the government? Do you think they will swing in behind this?
I'm hoping so. We can't get any sort of justice for the past victims of this crime, but what we can do is we can safeguard against future victims. And what everybody said there, I've got to say, we've actually got 5 cross-political parties who all agree that spiking should be recognised within the law. And if we do get this passed and spiking is recognised as a crime in its own right, then everybody is going to have to up their game. And that's exactly what's needed, because currently people only do what they have to do. It's such a shame when we've got young people on our streets getting spiked every weekend, and not just through drinks, I have to say, through vapes at the moment. This is such a dangerous position that we're all in. We've got young people on our streets trying vapes, try this BlackBerry one, and, you know, they're getting poisoned. It's vital that this law gets recognised.
Do you sympathise with what Dawn's saying more broadly about protecting young people, the sorts of crimes that really do disproportionately affect them?
Well, I talked to a senior police officer about spiking, and then we moved on to talk about vaping, interestingly, because serious organised gangs are now using vaping as a big money-making scheme as well. So the criminals will always find ways to manipulate and commit crimes, and we need to keep up with that. And on the spiking issue, we need to keep up with it in the law.
Right.
By keeping it as a separate
is there any
offence.
sense that it's young people on young people? I mean, is this something that's happening at universities and so on?
I mean, the universities are getting a lot better at recognising some of these vulnerabilities, and some of the nightclubs are as well, having people outside to make sure if people are coming out and they're on their own and they're vulnerable, there's someone there to try and help them. So people are beginning to understand these vulnerabilities a bit more, but I don't think we've done enough at all to protect, particularly, when it comes to violence against women and girls in this space. We've got an absolute long way to go.
And what does the research that you have done, or certainly anecdotally done, Dawn, in terms of whether it's young people perpetrating on other young people?
Well, unfortunately, like one of your guests just said, over 97% of victims didn't report this crime to the police. And when we delved into it to find out why, they come back, they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, there's no clear messaging. Some people didn't even realise spiking was a crime. This is why it's essential we show there's zero tolerance. On our initial findings, it showed that it was mainly between 18 to 24-year-olds, but this crime has no prejudice. It happens to men as much as it does to women and girls.
Right. I mean, Henry, it sounds like there is quite a lot of support for this, even if it is a bill being introduced by Richard Graham, a Tory backbench MP.
Yeah, absolutely. And, ultimately, given that the government is relatively short on wins at the moment, this could usefully be something that they could introduce before the next election. Why not?
Right.
I've not heard a case against this bill.
Right. It's strange that it hasn't been introduced then up until now.
Well, hopefully this 10-minute rule bill will give the government an opportunity to adopt it. I mean, I think there's cross-party consensus on this. I think many people watching the show today will be nodding their head in agreement. Crime always evolves. There's always new things that come onto the horizon. This is clearly an issue. It's been an issue for quite a while. This vaping development is a huge worry, and it feels like it's a no-brainer. You know, if you want to do, there's a clear problem, there is a solution. It would probably help the police as well, help with the data points. It's a no-brainer.
All right, well, thank you very much to Dawn. Obviously, you'll be watching closely to see what happens to this bill being introduced by Richard Graham. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. Just to point you to tomorrow, the programme, of course, at 11:15, covering Prime Minister's questions, and it will be the release of the Privileges Committee report into Boris Johnson. Another quiet day, you're absolutely right. And big news, a Politics Live podcast is now available, so please go and find it on BBC Sounds this afternoon. From all of us here, bye-bye.